Om Sadashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmaracharya Pariyantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Om. Good. Be seated, please. Shura. Om. Very good. Om Sahana Vavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahavidyan Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om. There we go. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to our many students watching online. We'll continue our study of the Bhagavad Gita today. And we'll begin with some chanting, beginning with verse 13. We're in chapter 6, Dhyana meditation. So starting with verse 13. And as always, as I'm chanting, glance at the meaning so that you know what you're chanting when you repeat after me. Samam kaya shiro grivam, samam kaya shiro grivam, dharayan achalam stiraha, dharayan achalam stiraha, samprekshya nasikagram swam, samprekshya nasikagram swam, Dishashchanavalokayan, Dishashchanavalokayan, Prashantatma vigatabhir, Prashantatma vigatabhir, Brahmachari vrate stitaha, Brahmachari vrate stitaha, Manasam yamyamachit Manasam yamyamachitto yuktaha sita matparaha yuktaha sita matparaha yunjanhevam saratmanam yunjanhevam saratmanam yogi niyatamanasah Yogi niyatamanasah shantim nirvana paramam shantim nirvana paramam matsamsthamadhi gacchati matsamsthamadhi gacchati nat yashnatastu yogosti Nat yashnatastu yogosti nachaikantamanashnataha nachaikantamanashnataha nachati swapna shilhasya nachati swapna Jagrato naiva charjuna Jagrato naiva charjuna Yuktahara viharasya Yuktahara viharasya Yukta cheshtasya karmasu Yukta cheshtasya karmasu Yukta swapnavabodhasya Yukta swapnavabodhasya Yogo bhavati duhkaha Yogo bhavati duhkaha Yada viniyatam chittam yada vinayatam chittam atmanyevavatisthate atmanyevavatisthate nispraha sarvakamebhyo nispraha sarvakamebhyo yukta hit yuchyate tada yukta hit yuchyate tada yatha dipo nivatasto yatha dipo nivatasto nengate sopamasmrita nengate sopamasmrita yogino yata chittasya yogino yata chittasya yunjato yogamatmanaha yunjato yogamatmanaha. Very good. Let us pick up the thread. We'll start today with verse 15. We finished verse 14 in a prior class. And the last sequence of verses, not the whole chapter, most of the chapter, as you understand, is dedicated to dhyana, meditation. Sri Krishna started off by saying that in his instruction, there are many different meditation techniques, and Sri Krishna's technique taught to Arjuna in this chapter is to turn your attention within to focus on your true self, Satchidananda Atma, which Sri Krishna identifies as being his presence within you. That so-called divine presence within every person. Sri Krishna says that is my presence within you. Meditate on that. Sri Krishna also described meditation as a process of preparation. This is rather a topic of mass confusion. Many people thinking all you need to do is sit and meditate. I think in the last class I commented on a comment on one of my videos by someone who observed that Buddha sat underneath a tree and he got meditated. What did I just say? He sat underneath a tree meditating and he got enlightened. Well, then I should be able to do the same. But as I mentioned in last week's class, that commenter omitted the fact that Buddha had engaged in 12 years of intense prior spiritual practice before sitting underneath that tree to meditate, and those 12 years of practice were crucial. So meditation is not the capital T-H-E, is not the means. On the other hand, it is a crucial practice for the sake of preparation. The preparation, as we've discussed, is actually twofold. One is removing raga dvesha, the raga dvesha which keeps you fixated on chasing after things in the world, and thereby distracting you from true spiritual life, spiritual practice. And that raga dvesha is overcome by gradually leading you to discover the true source of contentment and fullness within. If the true source of contentment and fullness is within, why should you be compelled to be chasing after things in the world? So that's one level of preparation accomplished through the process of meditation. The second is the very fact that your attention is being turned within. You will not discover your true nature until and unless your attention is turned within. Meditation trains your mind to look within, and in that way prepares you for gaining enlightenment. Okay, we have some wonderful verses today, so we will proceed with verse 15. Yunjan hevam saratmanam, yunjan hevam saratmanam, yogi niyatamanasah, yogi niyatamanasah, shantim nirvana paramam, Shantim nirvana paramam matsamstham adhigacchati. Matsamstham adhigacchati. Start in the second line. Yogi here means meditator, the practitioner of yoga. There, in chapter 3, yogi would have meant a karma yogi. Here in chapter 6, yogi means a meditator. Okay. That yogi who is niyata manasaha, one whose manas, mind, is niyata. That's an important word. Niyata, literally, yata, controlled. Niyata, completely controlled. I've translated it as disciplined. So niyata manasa is one whose mind is controlled, one whose mind is disciplined, one whose mind is trained. And early on, we discussed how meditation is a learned practice. Takes a lot of practice, a lot of training of the mind. How to restrain your mind from wandering around, everyone asks. And the very simple answer is practice. You just keep practicing that. Every time the mind runs away in meditation, you, figuratively speaking, you chase after your mind and bring it back. Mind runs away again, you chase after it again and bring it back. You continue to bring it back again and again. Each time you bring your mind back, your practice of meditation becomes stronger. It is the process of bringing your mind back. It is a bad metaphor, but if you're in a gym using weights, each time you lift those weights, your muscles get stronger. That's not a bad metaphor. So by lifting the weights, your muscles get stronger. By bringing your mind back, your meditation becomes stronger. Your mind becomes more disciplined. Niyata manasaha. So that yogi who is already prepared, we're not talking about a beginner meditator right now, beginning meditator, but rather one who has already done a lot of practice, because only through a lot of practice does your mind become disciplined, niyata. So that meditator, now first line, yunjan. In this context, it means meditating. Meditating on what? As we saw right at the beginning, Sri Krishna said, you meditate on, the word is at the end of the line, atmanam, on your true self. That true self being the inner divinity, Sri Krishna's presence within you. So yunjan, meditating, atmanam, on your true self. How? Evam, thus. Thus meaning in the manner that Sri Krishna has already been teaching for the last several verses. So according to this mode of practice taught by Sri Krishna, evam, thus in that manner, meditating on one's true self, atmanam, when, very interesting observation here, when, he uses this very strong word, sada, always, constantly meditating on oneself. Now, first comes a very practical question. When you're engaged in worldly activities, how is it possible to be constantly engaged in meditation? Obviously, not constantly engaged in formal, seated meditation, but in practice, it is possible for an advanced meditator, not a beginning one, an advanced meditator, to gains the capacity to, in the midst of daily activities, that person can appreciate one's true self. It takes only a moment. In just a moment, you do need to make your mind free for that moment. But in that moment, you can reflect on your true nature as Satchidananda Atma. And you can do that not constantly, but certainly periodically through the day. I told you, I think several classes ago, I told you that when I was a young computer engineer, I had a practice in which every time when I was in the office, in those days, these cubicles, I suppose even today, you sit in these cubicles, you got your workstation there. So I sat in my cubicle. By the way, those were days before desktop computers. So there were no desktop computers in those days, so there was no computer in my cubicle. When I wanted to use a computer, which was a giant IBM machine which filled up a room, you went to the terminal room. Terminal means you have a screen and a keyboard, and there are many people sitting. Anyway, I'm boring you with all these details. But my point is that my practice, which I told you before, is that every time my phone would ring in the cubicle, before I would answer the phone, I would take a few seconds for contemplation. Wonderful. What a nice, if you can do that in the midst of your busy workday, can you do it at home? Can you do it while you're driving a car? Driving a car is so easy. Every time you come to a stoplight, you've got plenty of time for contemplation. Anyway, don't think that spiritual practice, don't think that this introspective spiritual practice is confined to a half an hour of meditation each day. We've already discussed how karma yoga is meant to be practiced throughout each day, but karma yoga is an extrovert spiritual practice. We're now talking about an introvert spiritual practice, your attention turned within. Even that introverted meditative or contemplative practice can be done periodically throughout the day. So don't confine it to that 20 or 30 minutes in the morning or whenever you happen to meditate. So yunjan, meditating, atmanam, on one's true self, that inner divinity, Sri Krishna's presence within you, evam, thus in the manner that Sri Krishna has taught, sada, the advanced meditator, not limiting that practice to a few minutes of meditation today, but continually engaged. What does that advanced meditator gain? Look at the last line. Matsamstam adhigacchati. That advanced meditator, adhigacchati, reaches mat samstam. Mat is the pronoun for me. My abode. That meditator reaches my abode. Where is that abode? Don't think he's talking about Vaikuntha Loka, some divine spiritual realm out in the heavens. Your attention is turned within. When Sri Krishna says mat samstam, he is clearly referring to his divine presence within you. It's pretty obvious. And by turning your attention within in meditation, you adhigacchati, you reach, you gain, you realize mat samstam, Sri Krishna's presence within you, which is further described in the third line as shantim. Excuse me. A condition of perfect peace and contentment, not surprisingly. But the more interesting word here is nirvana paramam. We've seen that word nirvana before. Parama, that absolute expression of nirvana. We very carefully define nirvana as something being extinguished. And now we can interpret that nirvana, that being extinguished, in several ways. In a very simplistic way, nirvana is when all thoughts are extinguished, when your mind is perfectly silent. A more sophisticated interpretation of the word nirvana is when your sense of individuality is extinguished, when your identification with your body and mind is extinguished. And we can take it even a step further here. When what is extinguished, when that veil of ignorance that prevents you from discovering your already present divine nature. Look at the irony. And allow me to be a little silly or facetious here. Imagine Sri Krishna within you, and occasionally you get these, they're kind of comical looking, but you see lithographs, devotional literature, devotional images showing someone with a 6-inch tall Sri Krishna inside. Now, there's nothing wrong with it, but you get the point. The artist is trying to depict in a pictorial, in a image way, to show Sri Krishna's image inside. So if you imagine that 6-inch tall Sri Krishna inside of you, and Sri Krishna, now again, allow me to be a little silly, Sri Krishna is looking at you, looking up, I suppose, saying, hey, I'm waiting for you. I'm here all the time. When are you going to pay attention to me? When are you going to discover me? Sri Krishna has always been there. That mat samstam, my abode, Sri Krishna's abode within you, refers, of course, to your inner divinity, a divine nature which you've possessed from birth onwards. In fact, not from birth onwards, before birth. That inner divinity is an eternal truth preceding even this birth. That inner divinity is an eternal fact, an eternal truth, which oddly enough remains undiscovered. Oddly, because it's the truth of yourself. It's not some abstract or theoretical truth outside. It's not something that you have to achieve with scientific instruments looking out into the heavens. It's a truth already within you, waiting to be discovered, but apparently covered by that so-called veil of ignorance. So here, nirvana could be interpreted as the extinguishing of that veil of ignorance, the removal of that veil of ignorance, in which case you discover Sri Krishna. Sri Krishna has been waiting a long time for you to wake up and discover. So you wake up and discover, we call that enlightenment. I have a note here. It says it's like waking up from a bad dream. You know what it's like to wake up from a bad dream. So to discover that inner divinity is like waking up from a bad dream, because prior to that discovery, life's been tough. And there are plenty of good things in life, wonderful moments in life, but it's tough. And sometimes it's more tough than other times. That discovery removes the difficulty of life, removes the suffering of life. In that way, you wake up out of a bad dream. Okay. That word niyata manasa in the third line, I said it's rather important. In fact, it's so important, Sri Krishna is going to talk about that for the next 3 verses. What does it mean to have a mind that is controlled? Now, just to introduce the next verse, this idea of control and control of your mind, control of something which is inherently restless and fickle, you can imagine that to really hold that restless, fickle mind under control might be a very stressful and difficult job. And if you are engaged in meditation, I'm being silly again, but if you're trying so hard to control your mind, how is it possible to meditate? So let's understand what Sri Krishna means by a mind that is controlled, and not just mind. He's going to extend it here to your entire lifestyle. Let's see how he explains that. Natyashnatastu yogosti, natyashnatastu yogosti, nachaikantamanashnataha, nachaikantamanashnataha, nachati swapnashilasya, nachati swapnashilasya, jagrato naiva charjuna, jagrato chaiva charjuna. The meaning of the verse is quite simple. Na yogaha asti, putting the words together. Yogaha na asti, and here yoga means meditation. Na asti, nasti. There is no yoga, there is no meditation for whom ati ashnataha. Ashnataha, for one who eats. For one who eats ati, too much. There is no meditation for one who eats too much. Nacha, nor is there meditation for one who is ekantam anashnataha. Anashnataha, for one who doesn't eat ekantam at all. There's no possibility of meditation if you eat too much or if you don't eat at all. We'll just see the verse first and then I'll comment on it. Nacha, and further, there is no meditation ati swapna shilasya. For one who is given to ati swapna, too much sleep. And in the last line, na eva cha arjuna, and arjuna, na eva, there is no meditation for one who is jagrataha, always awake. I'll paraphrase. You can't meditate if you eat too much or if you don't eat enough. You can't meditate if you sleep too much or if you don't sleep enough. Very interesting observation he's making here. Maybe a good way to show the importance of this is to describe a very famous episode in the life of Buddha. Most of you know, he was raised in a palace and he saw the 4 terrible things and he left the palace and he took to a life of spiritual practice. A portion, not all, a portion of his life of spiritual practice was given to extreme austerities. And extreme means extreme. He was an extremely intense spiritual seeker. So when he practices tapas, penance, you can imagine his tapas will be extreme, and that apparently included not eating hardly anything. There are images of Buddha. Actually, throughout South Asia, you can see images of Buddha meditating with his hair having fallen out, his teeth are showing, his body is shrunken, and you can see each rib of his body. He is emaciated, and the imagery actually makes him look near death. He has fasted almost unto death. And the story goes that he practiced all this intense austerity and he didn't get enlightened. So that made him realize that all this intense austerity is a mistake. He almost died, according to the story, from being emaciated, from being underweight. He learned of an important lesson, and that is the extremes of austerity are unhealthy, undesirable, not productive for spiritual growth. Therefore, he later, after he became enlightened, the eightfold path he taught his disciples was called the middle path, or middle way. So Buddha is credited with teaching a middle way, and isn't that middle way is exactly what Sri Krishna is teaching here. Don't eat too much, don't eat too middle, don't eat too little. The middle way. In yogic literature, they'll say when you eat a meal, you should fill half your stomach should be filled with food, a quarter of your stomach should be filled with water, and a quarter of your stomach should be left empty. Now that last part is the crucial thing. Most people, we eat until we're satiated. We eat until we're full. Full means full. In fact, sometimes, especially holidays, in the American holiday of Thanksgiving is famous for people overeating, which means when you're full, don't stop. With all those goodies on the table, keep eating and eating and eating, and you know the sensation when you've eaten too much. It's uncomfortable to be overly full. So here, that yogic teaching to leave a quarter of your stomach empty means to be disciplined enough to stop eating before you're satiated. Do you think that would be a good diet technique? You bet. So very practical advice. Also, there's no meditation for one who sleeps too much or sleeps too little. Now, in austerities, and tapasya, the typical image is someone rising at 4 a.m. in the morning to perform spiritual practices, suggesting someone who doesn't sleep much at all. That's the extreme of tapas, which becomes an obstacle. I'll just give you a very obvious example from my own life. When I was a young student at Arsha Vidya Gurukulam during our 3-year course, I was in my 30s, and I decided, the course was very active because we'd spend a lot of time in class with Pujya Swamiji. We'd spend a lot of time studying before and after those classes. We'd spend a lot of time working. Working was part of in fact, we were building the ashram in those days, so I spent a good part of each day doing construction projects. The days were very full, and I wanted more time in each day for study and meditation, so I decided I would gradually cut back my sleep. So, gradually, that was a trick. So I started off maybe sleeping 7 hours a night, then I gradually cut it back to 6. Actually, gradually, I mean I cut it back from 7 to 6.5. Then I cut it back to 6. Then I cut it back to 5.5. Then I cut it back, I think I got down as low as 5. And I was in such bad shape. I was a mess. I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't speak clearly. I was falling apart emotionally. It was clearly harmful to have so little sleep. I was sleep deprived, as our medical professionals say. And I learned the hard way that by sleeping less, it was counterproductive to what I wanted to do. And most of my adult life, I've been focused on trying to reduce my sleep so that I have more time to do what I need to do during the day. But now it took me a long, long time to understand that it's counterproductive. I'll be very honest. Now, my philosophy of sleep is to sleep as long and as deeply as I can, because then when I wake up, I'll be more productive, being well rested. So just another illustration of what Buddha called the middle way, and Sri Krishna very clearly describes that middle way in this verse. We'll continue. Yukta hara viharasya, yukta hara viharasya, yukta cheshtasya karmasu, yukta cheshtasya karmasu, yukta swapnavabodhasya, yukta swapnavabodhasya, yogo bhavati duhkaha, yogo bhavati duhkaha. Start in the last line. Yogaha bhavati, yoga, meditation, or even spiritual practice in general, either way, bhavati becomes duhkaha, the remover of dukkha. And I think this is done intentionally to show the irony of extreme ascetic practices which cause dukkha. And here he says, dukkha ha. Those practices, your spiritual practice, should remove suffering, shouldn't add to your suffering. So yoga, spiritual practice in general, and meditation in particular, bhavati becomes dukkha ha, a remover of suffering for whom? For one who is treading the middle path. And Sri Krishna describes that one treading the middle path, starting the first line. For the one who is yukta, ahara, and vihara. For the one who's ahara, food, meals, and vihara, recreation, or activities in general, but it can also mean recreation. One whose food and recreation is yukta, and here yukta would mean regulated, disciplined, but disciplined not in the extreme way, in that middle way, as Sri Krishna just described. So one whose eating and recreation is regulated, controlled to be in that middle path. One who is karmasu in all of their actions, yukta cheshtasya. One whose cheshta means physical activity, is yukta, regulated. One whose physical activities are regulated, karmasu, in all activities. I bet you've made this mistake. I certainly have. And that is, especially as we age, as I am, we overextend ourselves physically and then pay the price later. So if you're working on like a huge gardening project, as an example, you might overexert yourself doing that physical work in the garden. Or something I've noticed, I used to go for like a 3-mile vigorous walk behind the ashram. Now I find that if I walk for 3 miles vigorously, I'm a little overtired. And we're learning that our physical activity should be regulated. And that's what he says here. You should get exercise, but you shouldn't overextend yourself physically, is what Sri Krishna says here. Also, yukta swapna avabodhasya. This is what we just discussed. Your swapna, sleep, and avabodha, waking, should be yukta, regulated. They should be following the middle path. In this way, you have an ideal lifestyle for meditation. And we can do it, we must do it. And I'll just make a closing comment here before we go on. I know many of you have very demanding lives, lots you need to do, and some of you, I'm sure, do not get enough sleep each night. You're cramming so much into each day, there simply isn't enough time, so you end up staying up late at night to finish everything up, and then in the morning you have to get up early and go to work. If you're not getting enough sleep, it is counterproductive. I learned that. Every doctor will tell you that. If you don't get enough sleep, you can actually damage your health. So it's crucial to get enough sleep. Yukta swapna avabodhasya, for your sleep and waking to be properly regulated. Then, continuing on this topic, just introduced this verse, we can ask a legitimate question: how much discipline is required? How much is enough? So we're talking about taking that middle way. So how much should I sleep? How much should I restrict my diet? How strictly should I control my mind? So that question, how much discipline, is answered by Sri Krishna in this next verse. Yada viniyatam chittam, yada viniyatam chitman, atman yeva vatisthate, atman yeva vatisthate, nispraha sarva kamebhyo, nispraha sarva kamebhyo, yukta hit yuchyate tada, yukta hit yuchyate tada. So, how much is enough? Yada, when your chittam, when your mind is niyatam, controlled. How much controlled? So that atmani eva, next line, breaking the words apart, atmani eva, in yourself alone, avatishtate, your mind abides. How disciplined should your mind be? It should be disciplined enough so that it abides within. So that in meditation, you gain the skill. And I said before, meditation is a learned skill. So you develop the skill to such an extent that you no longer have to constantly chase after your mind and drag it back, but rather your mind avatishtate abides atmani within. Your mind comes to a rest focused within. He's giving very clear and specific advice here. How much discipline is enough? Enough so that your mind can abide within. You no longer have to chase after it and bring it back. A mind which is nispraha, free from craving, free from attachment, free from grasping, free from desires. Sarva kamebhyaha, free from all, literally, free from all desires. This freedom from desire, our commentator, Madhusudana Saraswati, for a second time in this chapter, he uses the word para-vairagya. And I used this term in a prior class. Vairagya, you know as dispassion. There are many ways of understanding vairagya, but here the commentator is distinguishing para-vairagya, absolute dispassion, to distinguish it from conventional dispassion. Conventional dispassion is when you get it, that no amount of worldly effort will culminate in perfect peace and contentment. I'll say that again. When you really get it, that no amount of worldly effort will culminate in perfect peace and contentment, this recognition gives you vairagya, dispassion. conventional dispassion. It's conventional dispassion because it's based on a negative principle. Sorry for being a little technical here. The negative principle is knowing the unsuitability of worldly effort, the incapacity of worldly effort. In Sanskrit, it's called dosha darshanam. Dosha darshanam means seeing the defect of worldly effort. Better said, seeing the limitations of worldly efforts. So worldly efforts can get you a lot of things. You can get a nice house, a nice car, etc., etc. But the limitations are there. All those worldly efforts, you can have the nice car, you can have the nice house, but they don't guarantee perfect peace and contentment. That's the worldly limitation. That's dosha darshana, recognizing the limitations of worldly life. That's conventional vairagya. As compared to what he's describing here as paravairagya, being nispraha, not attached, sarva kamebhyaha, with regard to all possible objects of desire, being completely detached. He describes it as paravairagya, which is distinguished as being not due to this dosha darshana, seeing the limitations or defects of worldly life, but rather from atma darshana, seeing the truth of yourself. Dosha darshana, seeing the defects or limitations of worldly life, gives you conventional vairagya. Atma darshana, seeing your innate fullness and completeness, seeing that the true source of contentment and peace lies within, discovering that you already possess that which you want to gain. That discovery leads to, culminates in para vairagya, this absolute vairagya. So to summarize that, conventional dispassion is based on dosha darshana, seeing the limitations of worldly life, as compared to para vairagya, which is based on atma darshana, discovering your true nature. And discovering means even a glimpse. You don't have to be a great Mahatma, a great saint, to gain this para vairagya, even a glimpse. And you've already had this glimpse, maybe in a class, maybe in meditation, a glimpse in which you say, yes, it's true. The true source of contentment and peace is my innate nature. Just a glimpse of that reality, not as a concept, not to say, yes, I know Vedanta says that the true source of contentment is within. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is your personal discovery of your true self, that true self being the consciousness which is present in your experience right now. That consciousness, which you often think is ordinary, that consciousness is the actual source of contentment, peace, joy, and love. To discover that already existent fact culminates in para vairagya, that higher form, the absolute form of dispassion. So, we introduced this verse by saying, when will your mind be sufficiently disciplined? He says, yada, when, viniyatam chittam, when your mind is sufficiently disciplined, that atmani eva avatishtete, that it abides in oneself, being nispraha sarvakamebhyaha, gaining this paravairagya, not being pulled at all by the attractive force of anything outside of you, tada, in the last line, last word, tada, then. First word, yada, when, and ending the verse, tada, then, when your mind has become sufficiently disciplined to dwell within, focused on the true self, when your mind has gained this paravairagya, when that glimpse of your inner fullness has made you immune to raga, dvesha, being dragged about into worldly activities, then yuktaha iti uchyate. Then uchyate, it is said that you are yuktaha. And here yuktaha, sufficiently disciplined. How's that? You are sufficiently disciplined when your mind can abide within and when you are freed from raga and dvesha. Okay, now this next verse is much quoted and much misunderstood. So I'm glad we can discuss this today. Yatha dipo nivatasto, yatha dipo nivatasto, nengate sopama smrita, nengate sopama smrita, yogino yata chittasya, yogino yata chittasya, yunjato yogamatmanaha, yunjato yogamatmanaha. So that famous metaphor you've heard before, yatha, just as, a deepaha, a lamp, oil lamp. With an oil lamp which is nivata staha. Vata is wind. Nivata staha, in a windless place. A lamp which is protected from wind. Na ingate, you have to break the words apart, does not flicker. A lamp in a windless place does not flicker. You've probably seen a lamp in a glass enclosure. They do this frequently in India, in a temple or maybe in an outside location where they want a lamp to burn without being disturbed by the wind. They'll put a glass enclosure about it. And if you look closely at that lamp, na ingate, it doesn't flicker. And sometimes it can actually look uncanny, as if that flame were drawn on the air, like an image, frozen and superimposed on the air. Of course, it's just an impression. So this is a common metaphor, sa upama. Upama means metaphor. Sa upama, with this metaphor, smrita. Yoga is literally remembered, yoga is considered, meditation is considered to be sa upama, like that flame in a windless place that doesn't flicker. Lovely and important, but don't make the wrong conclusion that the lamp that doesn't flicker represents a perfectly silent mind. This is the common interpretation, and it's wrong. The lamp that doesn't flicker does not represent a mind that's perfectly silent. And it'll take a few minutes to show why that's so and how meditation works. So we have some time here at the end of the class. Let me show you how a very wonderful way of understanding how the mind works and how meditation trains the mind not to wander. Let me go to the board. There's some nice ways of showing you on the board. I have to press buttons here. That's right, buttons. Okay. So, usually our minds are engaged in a process called associative thinking. Yes, just Just checking to make sure I'm still on the camera. And associative thinking is a term drawn from psychology that describes the way our minds work. And that is, our minds go from one thought to the next thought, to the next thought, to the next thought. If you're engaged in problem solving, step 1 leads to step 2, leads to step 3, leads to step 4. If you're not engaged in problem solving, you're just hanging out with your friends, you have a conversation, and your conversation starts with topic A, and it segues to topic B, and it drifts on to topic C and D, etc., etc. This describes a process of associative thinking where our minds drift from thought A to thought B to thought C to thought D, etc. This flow of thoughts. And it's called associative thinking because you get from A to B because there's an association. B is associated with A. Thought C is associated with B, and so forth. So this association between similar thoughts or ideas lead our minds to wander. That's ordinary, or not just wander. This could also be problem solving. Step A, step B, step C, etc. Our minds are used to going from one thing to another to another. We'll call this associative thinking. This is the opposite of meditation. And the very simple but clear way of describing meditation is we replace a train of associated thoughts, linked thoughts, we replace them with one thought that repeats. For example, when you take up a mantra for the sake of meditation, suppose your mantra is Om Namah Shivaya. Good. So you chant Om Namah Shivaya mantra. And after you're done chanting Om Namah Shivaya, what do? You mentally chant the same mantra again. And then you chant Om Namah Shivaya again and again and again. Notice what meditation does then. We're talking about mantra japa in particular. What it does is it replaces a series of related or associated thoughts. This train of associative thinking is replaced with a train of identical thoughts. So the series of related thoughts is replaced with a series of identical thoughts, and it need not only be a mantra. Suppose you're looking at a candle flame. So if your first thought is candle flame, and then your second thought is candle flame, your third thought is candle flame, you have replaced the associative thinking with this focused meditation. Or if you're meditating on your breath, inhalation, breath is followed by breath, is followed by breath, is followed by breath. You get the idea. A basic principle of meditation is to replace a series of wandering thoughts with a series of identical thoughts. And in the commentaries on the Yoga Sutras, the main texts on meditation, this is much discussed. They call it, I mean not bother you with the Sanskrit, sajatiya vritti pravaha. A pravaha, a flow of vrittis, thoughts, which are sajatiya, of the same sort. A flow of identical thoughts. Now let me describe this, the consequence, the significance of this. When you are chanting a mantra, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Is your mind perfectly silent? You're chanting the mantra, right? Or if you're concentrating on your breath, or if you're concentrating on a candle flame, your mind is engaged in action, but an unusual kind of action, an action in which every thought is followed by an identical thought. Now, if you're an experienced meditator, you already know what I'm going to tell you. And that is, when you are focused on that flow of identical thoughts, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya, experientially, you feel like your mind has stopped. It hasn't stopped, but you feel a tremendous sense of stillness within, because your mind is no longer wandering all over the place. It is fixed on that mantra or whatever you're meditating on. And with the mind fixed on your object of meditation and no longer wandering, that is experienced as a sense of stillness, deep stillness. Meditation. This is the stillness of meditation. But notice, it's a stillness that comes about not through making the mind silent, but rather restraining the mind from wandering and focusing it on the object of meditation. I've already used that laser beam metaphor. So just as light can be focused into a laser beam, what I've shown on the board, where the mind is focused on the mantra, that's the equivalent of having your mind focused like a laser beam focused on the object of meditation. Now, the common metaphor that's used in the Yoga Sutras is not this one of the candle flame. And I'll come to this metaphor in just a moment. The metaphor that's used more often is that of pouring oil. Taila dhara. So when you pour, and here's the metaphor. Suppose I have a vessel of oil, and I'm going to pour it from this vessel to another vessel. And suppose I pour it very slowly and steadily, without moving my hand at all, so that out of the upper vessel, what comes is a ribbon of oil. And if I don't move my hand, that ribbon of oil will be absolutely steady. So now imagine that absolutely steady, motionless ribbon of oil. It will look like that ribbon of oil is suspended in space if you do it properly. You can imagine. That ribbon of oil looks like it's suspended in space, but the reality is, inside of that ribbon, oil is in constant motion, correct? So here you have the oil in constant motion, giving rise to the illusion that the ribbon of oil is suspended, motionless in space. That is a great metaphor. This is used in all the commentaries on the Yoga Sutra to describe the process of meditation. Stillness in motion. There is motion of the oil within the ribbon, but the ribbon is motionless. This describes a mind in meditation. This describes a mind where your mantra is followed by mantra, is followed by mantra. That consistent flow of mantras in your mind is represented in this metaphor as that consistent flow of oil. Now, this describes meditation then not as a state of total silence, but as a state of total focus. Can I say that again? It's not a state of total silence. Although there are meditation techniques that result in silence, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about meditation techniques whose goal is not perfect silence, but whose goal is perfect focus, which means your mind is perfectly focused on the mantra, just like that perfect flow of oil. Now, coming to this candle flame thing, I'm not sure if the ancient rishis understood the physics of a flame, but you can certainly understand the physics of a flame. You understand that the process of burning, combustion is the term that chemists use, oxidization, they'll call it, and the result of that is gas, which is so hot it glows. When you look at that candle flame, what you are seeing is glowing gas. Gas that's a little cooler glows blue. Gas that's hotter glows orange. And gas that is hottest glows yellow. What you're looking at is glowing gas, that candle flame. And you might also know that heated gas flows upwards. It's less dense, it's lighter than the air around. The air around the flame, so I'm boring you with the science, but let me just finish it quickly. The air around the flame is cold and dense. The gas within the flame is very light. And therefore, the gas within the flame goes upwards, which is why a flame goes up. Notice flames don't go sideways, flames don't go downwards, they go up for this reason. Now the reason I'm boring you with all this science is this, that superheated glowing gas inside the flame is in constant motion. It's not stuck. So it starts out at the wick and is glowing maybe a little blue, a little cool. And then as it moves up, it heats up as the combustion gets going. And then when it reaches the far extreme, as that gas goes up, it finally cools off and you don't see it anymore. When the gas is superheated and going up, you see it glow. When it cools off enough, it keeps going up. You just don't see it anymore. If the flame is here, you put your hand up here, you'll feel that hot gas going up. That's why it feels hot. The point I'm making with all this boring science is that just like oil inside that ribbon is in constant motion, but it looks motionless, in the same way, that hot gas inside the candle flame is in constant motion, but that motion is so uniform. Just like the motion of the oil inside the ribbon, the motion of the hot gas inside the flame is so uniform that flame looks motionless. Constant motion giving rise to the experience of motionlessness. There are many kinds of meditation. This is a form of meditation, but in the Yoga Sutras, it gets the technical name Sampragnata Samadhi. He calls it it's Samadhi. He calls it Samadhi. Your mind is still working, but not in its usual random way. Your mind is working in a very focused way. And that's why Patanjali calls it Samadhi. Now, next time you see this expression given, just like a lamp doesn't flicker, please know that it doesn't necessarily mean that the mind is silent. Yes, your mind can be made silent through yogic techniques, but that's not really the technique we're talking about here. When Sri Krishna, well, let's finish the verse, and I'll show that point here. So the first half of the verse is a metaphor. Just as a lamp in a windless place doesn't flicker, in the same way, yoginaha, now second half, yoginaha, for a yogi, for a meditator, yata chittasya, for that yogi whose mind is yata, controlled, for that yogi who is an experienced meditator, that yogi who is yunjataha, who is meditating, yunjataha yogam, practicing meditation, meditating on atmanaha, meditating on oneself. And here's the point. The mind is not silent. The mind is engaged in focusing on Atma. Let me change my diagram up here. So instead of, my example here was having your mind focused on a mantra, like Om Namah Shivaya, Om Namah Shivaya. Suppose instead your mind was focused on Atma. To appreciate your true nature as Satchidananda, to appreciate that inner divinity, to appreciate Atma. So suppose your mind in meditation appreciates Atma, and that appreciation of Atma is followed by an appreciation of Atma, is followed by an appreciation of Atma, is followed by, notice I didn't say experience of Atma. That's a huge problem. Atma is the experiencer and not something you experience. So I'm not saying experience of Atma. I use the word appreciation. Your attention is focused on Atma. Your attention is turned within on that towards the essence of your being as consciousness, and that appreciation can continue in your mind. That's the form of meditation Sri Krishna is talking about here. Yunjan yogam, practicing meditation, concentrating on what? Atmanaha, on your true self, on Satchidananda Atma. Okay. So it's very important here to understand that meditation is not simply making your mind silent. If meditation were simply making your mind silent, every night in dreamless sleep, you'd be meditating nicely. That's not meditation, that's sleep. Meditation is not, you cannot reduce meditation to merely making your mind silent. So here we've had a very important discussion about how, yes, there are forms of meditation in which your mind does become silent, but the form of meditation Sri Krishna is teaching here is not that. It's instead of making your mind silent, it's to make your mind focused, concentrated, like that laser beam, and concentrated on what? Atma, on your true self, which Sri Krishna says is your divine nature, which Sri Krishna goes on to say, it's his divine presence within you. To constantly appreciate that inner divinity is the form of meditation Sri Krishna describes here. Okay, we will stop here for today. Some announcements, in fact, important announcements. First, tomorrow, Sunday, we have our usual satsanga, question-answer session at 6 p.m. Please join us. And then a week from today is New Year's Day. And usually on New Year's Day, we have a big celebration. And on past New Year's Days, let me show our viewers, on past New Year's Days, our hall has been filled. 300 or 400 people coming to celebrate New Year's Day. We've had wonderful celebrations. Unfortunately, last year we couldn't celebrate New Year's Day because of the pandemic, and I'm afraid we're in the same situation today. So because of the virus, we will not have a celebration. By the way, just a side note for this virus thing, I hope you're all getting your booster. It turns out that with this new variant coming, getting your booster will be very, very important. So in addition to your 2 vaccination shots, please make sure that you've had the booster. What we will do, though, is since we don't want to fill up this room, that would be the wrong thing to do in the midst of this pandemic. But it's perfectly safe to have a smaller group as we are today for class. So we will meet next Saturday, New Year's Day, for class. What a great way to start the year anyway. So instead of a big celebration, we'll have a normal class. So please come next week for class. Okay, we'll conclude with our brief prayers at the altar. Om Gananahan Tva Ganapatigam Havamahe Kaving Gavinam Upamashravastamam Jeshtarajam Brahmanam Brahmanaspatahana Shrinvan Utabasira Sadhanam Om Mahaganapataye Namaha Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Vasudeva Sutam Devam Kamsachanuramardanam Devaki Paramanandam Krishnam Vande Jagadgurum Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinaha Sarve Santu Niramayaha Sarve Bhadrani Pashyantu Ma Kaschad Dukkha Bhag Bhaveta Asato Ma Sadgamaya Tamaso ma jyotirgamaya mrityor ma amritangamaya. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Tat Sat.